What happens when a beloved Hollywood legend sits down for what should be a friendly chat about his new movie, only to find himself under attack from a host who seems more interested in stirring up controversy than conducting an interview? It only took 34 seconds for Pierce Brosnan to realize that Denise Welch had no intention of treating him with the respect he deserved, and what followed was a clash that would expose the true nature of daytime television's most unpredictable personality. Pierce Brosnan walked onto the Loose Women set that morning, expecting nothing more than the usual promotional routine. Chat about the new film, share a few behind-the-scenes stories, maybe talk about his family. It was supposed to be easy, pleasant, professional. The kind of interview he had done hundreds of times before. But Denise Welch had other plans. From the moment Pierce settled into his chair, something felt different. The other panelists seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. Denise sat directly across from him, her eyes sharp and calculating. She barely waited for the cameras to start rolling before she pounced. "So Pierce," Denise began, her voice carrying that familiar edge that regular viewers knew all too well, "let's talk about your latest film. Though I have to say, I'm more interested in talking about some of the things you've said recently." Pierce raised an eyebrow, his famous charm still intact, despite the unexpected opening. "Well, I'm happy to discuss the film, Denise. It's quite an exciting project, actually." "Yes, I'm sure it is." Denise cut him off, leaning forward slightly. "But what I really want to know is about your comments regarding certain members of the royal family, particularly your thoughts on Meghan Markle." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Pierce maintained his composure, though those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. "I'm sorry, Denise, but I think there might be some confusion," Pierce replied calmly. "I haven't made any public statements about the Duchess of Sussex. I tend to keep my opinions about the royal family to myself." Denise's smile was cold. "Oh, come now, Pierce, don't play coy with us. We've done our research. You were quite vocal about certain situations, weren't you? About people who marry into families and then air their dirty laundry in public?" The other panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the direction anyone had expected the interview to take. Pierce's publicist, sitting just off camera, looked increasingly concerned. "Denise," Pierce said, his Irish accent becoming slightly more pronounced as it often did when he was trying to maintain his patience, "I think you may have me confused with someone else. I've always believed that family matters should remain private, and I've never commented publicly on any member of the royal family's personal affairs." But Denise wasn't backing down. If anything, Pierce's calm denial seemed to fuel her aggression. "Really?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "Because I have it on good authority that you've been quite critical behind closed doors, that you've called certain behavior attention-seeking and manipulative." Pierce set down the water glass he had been holding and looked directly at Denise. "I'm going to stop you right there. I don't know where you're getting your information, but it's completely incorrect. I've never made such comments about anyone, least of all about someone I've never even met." "But you have opinions, don't you?" Denise pushed. "About people who use their platform to attack institutions? About people who play the victim while living in luxury?" The tension in the studio was now palpable. Even the studio audience, who had come expecting light entertainment, seemed stunned by the hostility emanating from the host's chair. Pierce leaned back slightly, his expression hardening. "Denise, I came here today to talk about my work, not to engage in gossip or speculation about people's private lives. I think we should focus on why I'm actually here." "Oh, but this is so much more interesting, isn't it?" Denise replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Our viewers want to know what celebrities really think, not just the sanitized publicity speak." "What they're getting," Pierce said, his voice remaining steady but carrying an unmistakable warning, "is a host who seems more interested in creating drama than conducting a professional interview." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Denise's eyes flashed, and for a moment, it seemed like she might actually back down. Instead, she doubled down. "Drama?" she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Pierce, darling, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation. Isn't honesty what we're all after? Or do you prefer the Hollywood approach, where everyone pretends everything is wonderful all the time?" Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I prefer the approach where people treat each other with basic courtesy and respect, something that seems to be in short supply at the moment." The other panelists looked like they wanted to sink into their chairs. One of them finally attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we could talk about the film," she suggested weakly. "I'm sure our viewers would love to hear about your latest role." But Denise wasn't finished. "Oh, we'll get to the film," she said dismissively. "But first, I think Pierce needs to explain why he's being so evasive." If you haven't said these things, then surely you have some opinion about the situation? About people who bite the hand that feeds them? Pierce's famous composure finally showed its first real crack. You know what, Denise? You're absolutely right. I do have an opinion. My opinion is that ambushing guests with baseless accusations and trying to force them into controversial statements is unprofessional, and frankly beneath what I thought this show represented. The studio fell dead silent. Even Denise seemed momentarily taken aback by Pierce's direct response, but her recovery was swift. Ambushing? She repeated, her voice rising. Pierce, this is called journalism. This is called asking the hard questions that matter. No, Pierce replied, his voice gaining strength. This is called harassment, and I won't sit here and be party to it. The words hit the studio like a thunderbolt. Pierce Brosnan had just called out Denise Welch on live television, and the atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to explosive in an instant. Denise's face flushed red, her eyes narrowing dangerously. Harassment? She spat. How dare you sit in my chair, on my show, and accuse me of harassment when all I'm doing is my job? Pierce remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. Your job is to interview guests about their work, not to make up stories and then attack them when they don't confirm your fiction. I don't make up stories, Denise shot back, her voice climbing higher. I do my research. I ask the questions that need to be asked. Research? Pierce's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that what you call repeating gossip and trying to force me to comment on people I've never even spoken about? Because where I come from, we call that something else entirely. The other panelists sat frozen, clearly wanting to intervene, but not knowing how. The audience was completely silent, watching this train wreck unfold in real time. Even the camera operators seemed unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away. Denise leaned forward aggressively. You know what I think, Pierce? I think you're being defensive because you know I'm right. I think you have said these things, and now you're trying to backtrack because you don't want to deal with the consequences. Pierce's laugh was sharp and humorless. Consequences? The only consequence I'm dealing with right now is wasting my time sitting across from someone who clearly has no interest in conducting a professional interview. Professional? Denise's voice cracked slightly. You want to talk about professional? Let me tell you what's not professional. What's not professional is coming on a show and then acting like you're above answering honest questions. Honest questions? Pierce shook his head slowly. Denise, you haven't asked me a single honest question since I sat down. You've made accusations. You've put words in my mouth. And you've created an entire narrative that has nothing to do with reality. Denise's hands were visibly shaking now, whether from anger or adrenaline. It was impossible to tell. Don't you dare lecture me about reality. I've been doing this job longer than you've been making movies. Then perhaps, Pierce said quietly, his voice carrying more menace in its restraint than any shout could have, you should consider whether you've been doing it right. The studio gasped. Someone in the audience actually whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Denise looked like she had been slapped. How dare you, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. How dare you come into my house and insult me like that? I'm not insulting you, Pierce replied calmly. I'm simply pointing out that what you're doing right now isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, and it certainly isn't professional. It's a witch hunt based on information you can't verify about comments I never made. One of the other panelists finally found her voice. Maybe we should take a break, she suggested desperately. No, Denise snapped, not taking her eyes off Pierce. We're not taking a break, not until he explains himself. Explains myself? Pierce's composure was remarkable given the circumstances. What exactly do you want me to explain? That I didn't say something I didn't say? That I don't have opinions I don't have? You're asking me to prove a negative, which is impossible and frankly ridiculous. What I want, Denise said through gritted teeth, is for you to stop treating our viewers like they're stupid. Stop pretending you don't have thoughts about people who air their family's business on international television. Pierce was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. You want to know what I think about people who air their family's business on television? I think it takes a special kind of person to make their living by discussing other people's private affairs. I think it takes someone who has perhaps lost sight of the line between public interest and public entertainment. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Denise's mouth fell open slightly, then snapped shut. Her face went from red to pale and back to red again. Are you suggesting, she said slowly, that I don't know the difference between journalism and gossip? I'm not suggesting anything, Pierce replied. I'm stating quite clearly that what's happening right now has nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with trying to create a moment for your show at my expense. At your expense? Denise's voice climbed to a near shriek. You're a millionaire movie star. You think you can just waltz in here and act like you're too good to answer questions? I never said I was too good to answer questions, Pierce said patiently. I said I wouldn't answer questions based on false premises. There's a difference. False premises? Denise repeated mockingly. Everything is false premises with you people, isn't it? Nothing is ever true unless it makes you look good. Pierce's eyes hardened. You people? What exactly do you mean by that, Denise? The question caught her off guard. I mean celebrities, Hollywood types, people who think they can control every narrative. Ah, Pierce nodded slowly. And here I thought this was supposed to be about the royal family, but it's really about your issues with anyone who won't play along with whatever story you've decided to tell, isn't it? Denise opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed genuinely rattled. That's not, she started, then stopped. You're twisting my words. I'm not twisting anything, Pierce said. I'm simply following your logic to its natural conclusion. You started this interview with an accusation you couldn't support. When I denied it, you accused me of lying. When I questioned your methods, you attacked my character. And now you're upset because I'm not playing the role you assigned me. The other panelists looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether this was the best television they'd ever captured or the worst disaster they'd ever witnessed. Denise's voice, when she finally found it again, was barely above a whisper. You think you're so clever, don't you? Pierce leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. No, Denise, I don't think I'm clever. I think I'm tired. Tired of being ambushed, tired of being misrepresented, and tired of having my time wasted by someone who seems more interested in creating drama than having a conversation. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Pierce Brosnan had just delivered what felt like a masterclass in dignity under fire, and Denise Welch looked like she was about to combust from sheer frustration. Tired? She repeated, her voice cracking with indignation. You're tired? Well, let me tell you what I'm tired of, Pierce. I'm tired of entitled celebrities who think they can dictate how interviews should go. Pierce's expression remained calm, almost pitying. I'm not dictating anything, Denise. I'm simply refusing to participate in whatever this is supposed to be. If asking for basic professionalism makes me entitled, then I suppose I'm guilty as charged. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, afraid to break the spell of this extraordinary moment. Denise's hands clenched into fists on the desk in front of her. You know what? Fine. Let's talk about professionalism. Let's talk about how professional it is to come on a show and then refuse to engage with the topics we want to discuss. I came here to discuss my film, Pierce said simply. You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to discuss something that exists only in your imagination. If you'd like to talk about my actual work, I'm more than happy to do so. Your actual work? Denise sneered. Right. Because that's so much more important than addressing the real issues. Pierce tilted his head slightly. What real issues, Denise? The imaginary comments I never made about people I've never discussed? Those real issues? Denise's face went through a series of expressions, from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like panic. She was losing control of the narrative, and everyone in the studio could see it. You're being deliberately obtuse, she said finally, her voice tight. No, Pierce replied gently. I'm being deliberately clear. You've built this entire confrontation on a foundation that doesn't exist. And rather than admit that, you're doubling down and attacking me personally. One of the other panelists finally found the courage to speak up. Perhaps we should move on to discussing the film now? Denise whirled on her colleague with such fury that the woman actually recoiled. Don't you dare tell me how to run my interview. The outburst was so sudden and so vicious that it seemed to surprise even Denise herself. She immediately looked back at Pierce, as if realizing she had just proven his point about her professionalism. Pierce's eyebrows rose slightly. And there it is, he said quietly. There what is? Denise demanded. But her voice had lost its earlier fire. The real Denise Welch? Pierce said, his tone almost conversational. Not the professional interviewer you pretend to be, but the person who attacks anyone who doesn't give her what she wants, including your own colleagues. Denise's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. That's not. I didn't. You just screamed at your co-host for suggesting we discuss the topic I actually came here to discuss, Pierce pointed out. In what world is that acceptable behavior? The other panelists were staring at Denise now, and their expressions weren't sympathetic. The audience was completely silent, but the tension was so thick it felt like it might suffocate everyone in the room. Denise looked around desperately, seeming to realize for the first time how isolated she had become. The interview was going in a certain direction. The interview was going nowhere, Pierce interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of finality. Because you started it with a lie and then got angry when I wouldn't validate that lie. It wasn't a lie, Denise said weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Pierce leaned forward slightly. Then prove it. Show me where I made these comments you're so concerned about. Show me the interview, the article, the recording. Show me anything that supports what you've been claiming for the last 15 minutes. Denise opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at her notes, shuffled through them desperately, then looked back up at Pierce with something approaching defeat in her eyes. The sources were what? Pierce asked gently. Were unreliable? Were gossip? Were something you heard from someone who heard from someone else? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Denise's shoulders sagged slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. The sources weren't. They weren't direct quotes. Pierce nodded slowly. So you built this entire attack on secondhand gossip and rumors. You ambushed me on live television based on something you couldn't verify, and then got angry when I wouldn't confess to something I didn't do. I thought. Denise started, then stopped. You thought, what? Pierce's voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath. That you could bully me into saying something controversial? That you could create a moment for your show regardless of whether it was true or not? Denise looked like she might cry. The transformation was remarkable and terrible to watch. The aggressive interrogator had crumbled, leaving behind someone who looked lost and embarrassed. I was just trying to do my job, she whispered. Pierce's expression softened slightly. Your job is to inform and entertain your viewers, not to attack your guests with unsubstantiated claims. There's a difference between holding people accountable and what you did here today. The studio remained silent, but now it felt different. Less like anticipation and more like the aftermath of something that had gone too far. Pierce stood up slowly, removing his microphone with careful precision. I think we're done here, he said quietly. Pierce, wait! One of the other panelists called out desperately. We could still talk about the film. He paused and looked back at them with something that might have been sympathy. After what just happened, I don't think that would be appropriate. Denise finally looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. I'm sorry, she said, so quietly that the microphones barely picked it up. Pierce studied her for a long moment. I believe you are, he said finally. But sorry doesn't undo what happened here. Sorry doesn't give me back the 15 minutes of my life I spent defending myself against accusations that had no basis in reality. He walked toward the edge of the set, then paused and looked back one more time. You know what the real tragedy is, Denise? You have a platform that millions of people watch. You could use it to have meaningful conversations, to explore important issues, to actually make a difference. Instead, you used it to try to destroy someone based on nothing more than gossip and spite. With that, Pierce Brosnan walked off the Loose Women set, leaving behind a shattered host, a stunned panel, and a studio full of people who had just witnessed one of the most brutal takedowns in daytime television history. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Denise Welch sitting in stunned silence, the wreckage of her credibility scattered around her like debris after a storm.